Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to Grand Rounds, and today is an Engel Rounds presentation rescheduled from last week. We switched due to the MLK Junior Day and week last week. So before I introduce today's speaker, I just want to mention a few things. One is if you're viewing this on Zoom, your camera and microphone are off. They can't be turned on. Also, we hope people have questions or comments. Use the Q&A box to send those in, and we'll go over them at the end. But leave the chat box free for the panelists and interpreters. Third, we have a lot of good seats in the front half of the auditorium. People are allowed to sit there, including trainees. If you want to show full level of commitment and engagement with the activity today and department, don't be shy. Get up and move. Think about it. I know you're all thinking about it. Okay, moving on to other things. Our speaker today, I'm very happy and proud to introduce Dr. Tanya Tran. Dr. Tran is currently, for a few more days, a departmental fellow in psychiatry. She's about to be a senior instructor in psychiatry, and as soon as the paperwork is done, yes, and we've only been saying that for 6 months, but we've been assured that any day it will be done. So she will be a senior instructor in psychiatry. She was a fellow here. She has spent a lot of time helping to develop the INTERCEPT program, which is based at Strong Ties. That's the Interventions for Changes in Emotions, Perception, and Thinking, or INTERCEPT program, which is a clinical high risk for psychosis clinic. And Tanya is the psychologist over there and supervisor as well. So Tanya did her undergraduate, master's degree, and doctoral degree at Queen's University, which is in Kingston, Canada, a very good school, for those of you not familiar with Canadian schools. And then did her internship in clinical psychology at the Alberta Health Center, where she worked with Jean Addington, who's one of the pioneers in this field of clinical high risk for psychosis treatment. The idea being, if we can identify people early on who show signs of that they may be progressing towards a psychotic disorder, but they don't have a psychotic disorder yet, and intervene early and intensively, we may be able to prevent new cases of psychotic disorder, or at least delay the onset and improve people's lives and outcomes. So today is our first presentation in our department alone, and I see nobody's moving, so I'm going to just say, let's give a nice welcome to Dr. Tanya Tran. Okay, it's all yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Steve, for the lovely introduction. Wishing everyone a happy Lunar New Year. I feel very fortunate to be able to present today about my program of research, primarily focused on developing novel assessment tools and interventions for amotivation symptoms in psychotic illness. By the end of this talk, I hope I help you understand at least one way that motivation impairments affect the outcomes of individuals affected by psychosis. I plan to demonstrate how to adopt a biopsychosocial lens in conceptualizing diverse patient experiences of amotivation symptoms. Lastly, I hope you walk away with knowledge of at least one innovation in the assessment and treatment of these symptoms. Psychotic disorders are associated with substantial disruptions to everyday life. The most common life functions that decompensate include relationship quality, participation in social activities, employment, and self-care. Functional impairments can be detected as early as the first episode of psychosis. And these impairments persist or worsen with illness chronicity. Despite symptom resolution with antipsychotic medication, functional disabilities persist. Functional recovery in mental illness is the idea where treatment goals move beyond symptom resolution or symptom reduction. Treatment goals also focus on helping people participate fully in their lives, despite their diagnosis. So this may look like returning to school, previous roles, and returning to meaningful activities, or developing new interests and roles and interests. For much of my research career, I endeavored to understand what are the missing pieces in our understanding of the barriers to functional recovery. What are the missing pieces in our intervention models that can help narrow the gap between symptom resolution and functional recovery? At this time, we do not know very well what contributes to impaired functional status. After studies accounted for various factors like duration of untreated psychosis, positive symptoms, cognitive functioning, much of the variance, much of the pie is left over. Much of the variance in functioning remains unaccounted for. Meaning there may be factors that influence functional prognosis in psychotic illness that have yet to be better identified and studied. I'm here today to convince you that negative symptoms are an important piece of the functional recovery puzzle. Recall that psychotic illness can take on different presentations, depending on the constellation of symptoms across three classes. Negative symptoms are a core component of psychotic disorders. These symptoms present as a collection of behaviors and functions related to motivation, interest, verbal expression, and emotionality that have diminished or disappeared. Hence the term negative to denote that the symptom experiences are in deficit of normal human experiences. As you can see, negative symptoms involve deficits in functions that are quite critical to interact and participate in the world around you. Negative symptoms present as unique barriers for people with psychosis to achieve their life goals. In schizophrenia cases, greater severity of negative symptoms has been associated with worse functional outcomes, both cross-sectionally and longitudinally. Negative symptoms has been found to predict functional disability even after controlling for established contributors such as premorbid level of functioning and positive symptoms. So how do negative symptoms affect functional outcomes in early stages of psychotic illness? An estimated 90% of patients experiencing their first episode of psychosis present with at least one negative symptom that requires treatment. The relationship between negative symptoms and functioning, although apparent, tends to be relatively weaker and inconsistent in first episode cases compared to chronic cases. However, over time, the convergence of greater negative symptom severity and worse functioning grows stronger. As Dr. Silverstein mentioned earlier, we are fortunate to have innovations in well-validated screening tools that have allowed the identification of this unique population that is considered at clinical high risk for psychosis. This population has the potential to benefit the most from psychosis prevention efforts. In this CHR population, studies document at least one moderate to severe negative symptom occurs in 82% of CHR samples. Not only were negative symptoms found to be a significant predictor of functional decline, but they also predicted transition to a full psychotic disorder. In addition, what appears to be more strongly linked to worse outcomes in this CHR population is actually the duration of untreated negative symptoms instead of the severity of them. So what this means is even if someone has mild levels of negative symptoms, they will still benefit from intervention as it has potential to curb the progression of psychotic illness and functional decompensation. Thus far, there's growing consensus in the literature that I've told you about where negative symptoms can be present and debilitating at any phase of the psychotic illness. Negative symptoms that emerge during the prodromal at-risk stage usually take place during the late adolescence and early adulthood period, when maybe people are having their first romantic relationships, exploring new hobbies or interests, entering college. So you can imagine when the negative symptoms emerge during these developmentally typical and formative periods of their lives, the impact could be quite significant. So then this raises the question, how early in the illness course should we preemptively treat negative symptoms? In service of this question, I conducted a study seeking to understand the trajectories and long-term patterns of negative symptoms in CHR youth. The sample was drawn from the North American Prodrome Longitudinal Study, or the NAPLES study. The NAPLES study had the longest monitoring period of negative symptoms recorded in the CHR population. Over a 24-month period, negative symptoms were assessed by clinicians using a standardized clinical interview for psychosis risk syndromes. This rich data set afforded us the use of sophisticated growth curve models to map negative symptom changes over time. Portrayed here is the growth curve model of negative symptoms for the full CHR sample in this study. The y-axis represents total severity of negative symptoms and that were assessed from the clinical interview. On the x-axis, you have the many follow-up periods that were used in this study. So to our surprise, we found that in the overall sample, the negative symptoms followed a downward curvilinear trend. At baseline, or upon entry into the study, you can see that the sample was reporting some degree of negative symptoms, but over time that slightly reduced, but not fully resolving on average. When we divided the sample into two subgroups, subjects who transitioned to psychosis and subjects who did not transition to psychosis during the observation period of the study, this revealed nuances in the longitudinal pattern of negative symptoms. The transition group, represented by the red line, had more negative symptoms at baseline compared to the non-transition group, portrayed in blue. Within the first 6 months of observation, the transition group had a less steep drop in their negative symptoms. In other words, those who transitioned to psychosis experienced a negative symptom reduction at a slower rate than their non-transition peers in their study. In later months of observation, from 6 to 24 months, the transition group showed a more persistent pattern of negative symptoms that was more resistant to change. Moderation analyses also revealed that the CHR subjects with lower IQ and lower functioning had a harder time maintaining improvements in negative symptoms. The main takeaway from these findings is that the first 6 months after CHR clinic enrollment are a critical window for improving negative symptoms, after which less change can be expected. And this is particularly important among those with lower IQ and functioning. So despite all we know so far about why negative symptoms should be treated as early as possible, negative symptoms remain an unmet treatment need. This is for a few reasons. First, patients do not report these difficulties to their providers and actively seek treatments for these symptoms. Positive symptoms are often the first reason that get these individuals through the door of clinics, as positive symptoms are preoccupying, distressing, and easily observed by clinicians. In contrast, patients may not know that a lack of motivation or a lack of interest, a lack of emotional expressivity are a part of their psychotic illness. They may not know that it's appropriate to bring up these concerns to their providers. Second, negative symptoms are difficult to assess for. The clinical interviews out there, they rely on retrospective and prospective patient reports of experiences. They might be asked to describe their social interactions in the last 2 weeks, how much interest they had in their activities, or the degree of enjoyment that they anticipate from future activities. Can you remember how much you enjoyed a social interaction 2 weeks ago? Well, think about what happens when we have a patient with psychotic illness. They have cognitive deficits, so memory is impaired. It may be difficult to recall these personal experiences. And there's the fact that there's also negative symptoms that reduce communication and emotional expressivity. So that also hinders report of negative symptoms. Third, there's currently a lack of established pharmaceutical and psychotherapeutic interventions that adequately treat negative symptoms. And related to that point, available treatments for this patient population have not caught up with the latest discoveries of how and why negative symptoms develop and are maintained. There is a mismatch between symptom mechanism and treatment targets. And until we look for avenues to close this gap, our interventions are going to be ineffective. To improve precision of treatments for negative symptoms, we need to take a translational science approach. So much like how pharmaceutical agents are developed, new psychotherapies should be rooted in the neurobiological mechanisms of symptoms. This process of evidence-based treatment development usually starts off with establishing a preclinical model of symptoms to better characterize at a biological level how these symptoms develop and impair. The preclinical model can be translated into an assessment for humans so that we can understand how the biological processes that we learned about relate to symptom expression, relate to behaviors of the patient population. Next, a needs assessment can be carried out to confirm whether the currently available treatments appropriately address the biobehavioral symptom mechanisms. If a targeted treatment is lacking, a new program can be developed, piloted, and if showing preliminary effectiveness and safety, it can move on to clinical trials. So where do we start this work? I argue out of the collection of negative symptoms, there is a priority need to better understand how we can monitor and treat the 3 symptoms related to motivation and pleasure functions. These are collectively known as amotivation symptoms. This is because amotivation symptoms have been found to take the lion's share in predicting functional impairment in psychotic illness, even more than what negative symptoms related to emotions and expressivity account for. In addition, there have been new and exciting developments in our understanding of the neurobiological processes underlying amotivation symptoms. So these advances open the door for narrowing this gap between symptom mechanism and treatment targets. Much of we know about how amotivation symptoms come to be is based on learnings of how the human motivation system normally functions, and at which point does it fail in the context of psychotic illness. According to translational neuroscience, motivated action is a product of multiple active processes. This contrasts with popular knowledge that motivation is this drive or dial that we can turn up and down. I hear from a lot of my patients struggling with low motivation, amotivation symptoms. A lot of them say, I'm waiting for the spark to come back before I engage in hobbies, before I talk to this person in my life. Based on contemporary research of how the human motivation system works, the more components of this multi-stage model that are actively engaged, the more likely we are to perform a goal activity. So allow me to walk you through this model. The first piece is how much you like the activity. Our brains register how much pleasure, enjoyment, or other positive emotions we feel during a certain activity. The more we like an activity, the more motivated we are to do it. Motivation can also depend on how much we want an activity to happen. The more you look forward to an activity or predict to feel good when you complete the activity, the more likely we will take action. Another piece is reward learning. This is when our brains hold on to the lessons learned on which activities have been paired with positive experiences and which were not. Our brains keep an inventory of the hits and misses. We can use this to remember that in the past, we have benefited in some way from this activity, so we are motivated to do it again. Next, we start to measure the benefits of an activity we're considering engaging in. Motivation also depends on the costs of the activity. Understanding the costs and benefits of an activity sets us up for balancing both sides, before making an intentional decision to get started on the activity. After someone decides to pursue an activity, some sort of action plan is made, and a thoughtful plan will increase the likelihood that we will follow through with it. To apply a real-world example of how this model works, let's consider the motivated action of completing a grocery store trip. Perhaps someone is registering how much they normally enjoy interactions with friendly staff members at the grocery store, or they enjoy the smell of fresh food, and perhaps they look forward to finding good deals at the grocery store. They recall memories of past positive experiences at the grocery store. And then they think about, what are the benefits and the costs? Well, if I go to the grocery store and I buy my ingredients for food, I can eat healthier, I can adhere to a food budget, I can have a sense of independence because I'm buying my own ingredients to make my meals. The other cost is, wow, rush hour traffic. Do I really want to drive in rush hour traffic to go to the grocery store? There are long cashier lines. I have to carry those heavy bags home. Let's just say that this individual weighs the benefits more than the costs. And they come up with a thoughtful action plan of, I'll take the bus to the grocery store so I don't have to deal with the rush hour traffic. research has been able to trace each component of this model to a neurobiological mechanism. A takeaway from this version of this model, displayed here, is that the reward centers of the brain work in concert with parts of the prefrontal areas responsible for higher order cognition. They work in concert to execute these multiple processes that lead to motivated action. In schizophrenia, there have been observed impairments at each stage of this model of motivated action. So you can imagine how it comes to be that we observe amotivation symptoms in this population. People with schizophrenia, for example, often have trouble measuring benefits and costs and weighing these so that they come to a decision to initiate a motivated action plan. Patients tend to struggle with formulating in their minds the benefits of carrying out an action. And they also tend to overestimate the costs and the effort burden associated with an action. So my prior research sought to develop an objective performance-based assessment to better understand how cost-benefit analysis impairments bring about amotivation symptoms. So there is a preclinical model from addictions research that is used to understand the neurobiological basis of hedonic capacity and effortful drug-seeking behaviors, how these are altered when animal subjects are trained to choose between pressing a lever a small amount of times for a small amount of reward, or pressing a different lever more times for larger reward. Michael Treadway from Emory University developed a human version of this preclinical model. His computer-based task allowed the assessment of patients' willingness to expend physical effort in exchange for monetary incentives. You can see in the corner of this slide photos of what this task looks like if humans were to do it. They get a choice between an easy task where they make a certain number of button presses with their dominant index finger, and people in this room right at home, you can try this out right now. Use your dominant hand and try and make multiple taps on the table as fast as you can with your dominant index finger. Now try and do this with your non-dominant pinky finger while keeping your palm on the table. Obviously, a bit more effortful. So in this paradigm, each trial of the effort assessment simulates this cost-benefit decision-making scenario. Participants were shown a screen advertising the amount of reward that they could win if they, complete the easy task or the hard task. As well, they're told the chance of winning the monetary reward if they successfully completed the task. Then participants had to choose to complete the low effort, low payoff version, or the high effort, high payoff version. The physical effort task recorded patients with schizophrenia making significantly fewer choices to expend high physical effort tasks despite the promise for greater reward. Fewer choices to complete the high value hard task was associated with amotivation symptom severity. The more severe their amotivation symptoms, the fewer choices they made to expend physical effort or reward. These findings support that this task is a valid and objective assessment tool for amotivation symptoms. Much of this research, however, has focused on capturing reduced willingness to expend one type of effort, that is physical effort. Cognitive effort is arguably a common demand of daily tasks and activities. Planning a meal requires working memory. Tracking the content of a conversation, maybe processing speed and attention. Scheduling and adjusting your appointments in your timetable, executive functioning. I hypothesized if any motivation impairments to expend cognitive effort for reward may help us understand how amotivation symptoms develop, and maybe this will reveal to us how they relate to functional disability. So what I did was I conducted a study during the COVID pandemic. So it was also a test and study of my motivation to conduct research. But I developed and validated a novel biobehavioral measure that was parallel to Treadway's physical effort task, and that was sensitive to one's willingness to expend cognitive effort for reward. So the study was conducted in collaboration with the Heads Up Early Psychosis Intervention Program in Southeastern Ontario. There were 36 early psychosis patients in the sample. It's a smaller sample due to the challenges of recruiting subjects during the COVID pandemic, but it still allowed me to examine most of my research questions and look at trends. The study appointments were virtual, and the battery included clinical interviews of negative symptoms, positive symptoms, functioning, and cognition. And I administered the physical and cognitive effort tasks. So, like I mentioned before, the cognitive effort task was parallel to the design of Treadway's physical effort task. The task involved completing an easy or hard difficulty level of the letter variant NBAC task. This is a task of working memory. So an easy trial meant participants had to track the letters that showed up on the screen and indicate if the letter was the same that was shown one step back. The hard trial involved participants tracking letters that were shown 2 steps back. Trust me, I won't get you to try this out like I did the physical effort task. I trust that everyone here has really good working memory and motivation for cognitive effort, so I won't humor you with a demonstration of this. But when we administered these tasks and we assessed, functioning and negative symptoms, what did we find? I found that effort expenditure indices had an indirect effect on functioning. Specifically, fewer choices to expend cognitive effort was currently related to lower functional status through its relationship with greater severity of amotivation symptoms. At the same time, fewer choices to expend physical effort had an indirect effect on lower functional status through higher severity of those emotional expressivity negative symptoms. I also examined whether effort indices accounted for unique variance in functioning. Does it account for more pieces of that pie that I showed earlier of the functional recovery puzzle? And I found that a combination of cognitive and physical effort modulation accounted for 20% of unique variance in concurrent life functioning over and above the variance accounted for by cognition and duration of untreated psychosis. Controlling for all other variables in the model, there was a trend that came out where greater cognitive effort modulation relating to better concurrent functioning at a small to medium effect size. So overall, these trends suggest that cognitive effort has more implications for functioning than physical effort. Whether cognitive effort indices are unique predictors, of functioning has yet to be confirmed in larger samples, preferably not during a COVID pandemic. Future treatments should consider, though, targeting impaired motivation to approach cognitively demanding activities, as these activities may be significant for adaptive life functioning. So I was inspired by all this research on advances in the neurobiological underpinnings of amotivation symptoms. And I was curious to conduct a needs assessment, whether these treatments are existent Or are they available, and do they appropriately target the mechanisms that we've learned from translational neuroscience? So what I did was conduct a needs assessment within Alberta Health Services. There is a CHR and an early psychosis as well as an adult psychosis clinic in Alberta Health Services. And what I sought to answer was the question of, have clinical settings implemented motivation interventions that adequately address the multiple facets of motivation dysfunction known by contemporary research? So does it address that multi-stage model of motivation that I showed earlier? And is there a patient need for an adapted psychological intervention that aims to target motivation impairments? So I distributed a survey to clinicians within the psychosis services at Alberta Health Services. And I also recruited a group of patients, a focus group. Clinicians reported a wide range of interventions that they currently use with the aim of remediating motivation difficulties experienced by their patients. So the most common intervention was provision or referral to psychological therapy, followed by SMART goal setting or referral to a community-based rehabilitation or skills training program. Clinicians were also surveyed on the degree to which they believed that interventions they reportedly use, how do they address the multiple components that are known to be essential for the initiation of motivated action. So as you can see in this graph, on the y-axis are components of that model that I showed you earlier. So currently implemented interventions were rated by clinicians as somewhat effective in addressing difficulties with action planning or goal setting, indecisiveness to initiate tasks, and exaggerated idea of the amount of effort required to engage in activity. Processes that are relatively less addressed by the current interventions that the clinicians used included problems with persisting on a task, underestimated benefit or value of engaging in activity, and reduced ability to look forward to activities. Overall, the clinician data suggests that a significant portion of the patients in the psychosis clinics struggle with amotivation symptoms, and an eclectic blend of the current treatment options slightly to somewhat effectively target the multiple processes involved in motivated behavior. The takeaway here is that there is room to grow for current intervention approaches to address amotivation symptoms as we understand it. The patient surveys revealed that motivation difficulties subjectively were considered moderately distressing. I also administered a cognitive motivation self-report scale that I developed that has two factors that allows us to understand cognitive approach and cognitive withdrawal. Cognitive approach being reward responsiveness, drive, and seeking of cognitive tasks, those appetitive motivation processes, and cognitive withdrawal being avoidance, disengagement, worry, and anxiety associated with cognitive tasks. When I administered this to our focus group of patients, what we found was enjoyment of cognitive activities positively correlated with quality of occupational functioning. Avoidance and withdrawal from cognitive activities, that negatively correlated with quality of occupational family home functioning. In addition, 100% of the patient focus group members were interested in a psychotherapy intervention for motivation. They all asked me, Dr. Tran, when are you going to start this intervention? I want to sign up for it. And I had to say, I'm sorry, I'm still working on it. Talk to me in maybe a 1 year's time. I also provided some common myths and truths about how the human motivation system works, because I was interested in how much patients were aware of basic psychological principles. Were there maybe distorted ideas of how their motivation works? So a few knowledge gaps were evident. A majority of the focus group thought that the amount of effort and activity involves does not influence their decision to start an activity. And a lot of them did not know that memory of past experiences with an activity and cognitive skills influence their motivation. There was even one individual who disagreed that motivation naturally waxes and wanes, and that motivation should be there, and if it's not, then that's a problem. So the key takeaways from this needs assessment is that patients hold potentially detrimental misconceptions of how their motivation system should work. Clinicians also reported that current interventions were only slightly to somewhat effective in addressing a motivation. And a psychological intervention targeting motivation is valued by both clinicians and patients. So I'm excited to talk about my next steps after this needs assessment, which involved a pilot study of a motivation therapy program that I designed to address motivation symptoms and the underlying mechanisms of these symptoms. So this is a pilot study that I'm conducting at the U of R, and it involves a 10-session individual therapy program. There is an assessment before engaging in the therapy program, afterwards, and 3 months follow-up. The sessions generally followed a CBT structure. Firstly, we would go over therapy homework review or individualized goal setting if is the first session. There's time for psychoeducation, and the psychoeducation piece translated in an accessible manner the research on what are some common barriers of motivation, or what are some common difficulties people with psychosis have with cost-benefit analysis, or being sensitive to rewards in their environment. Next, in the session, we would demonstrate a new therapy skill or strategy. There would be in-session practice of new therapy skill or strategy, and then a session summary and planning of therapy homework. So this is a broad overview of what the 10-session therapy program looks like. The first 2 sessions teach that multi-stage model of motivation that I showed everyone earlier, but in a very accessible manner. And I then teach them skills to what we call check your gears, which is monitoring like your level of motivation. Are you in passive motivation? Are you in active motivation? Being able to monitor when you are feeling low motivation is important to set up your skills that you learned from therapy and apply them to augment your motivation to engage in your activities. The rest of the sessions you can see have a dedicated session per component of that model of motivation. We talk about identifying pleasures in life. We talk about using savoring to increase wanting of rewards in your environment, building anticipation for activities. How do we balance costs and benefits and make decisions to get active? There's a behavioral activation component, and then there's education on how we can optimize cognition to help build a motivating lifestyle. Something that is novel to this therapy program is cognitive activation. And that's my version of behavioral activation, where we are intentionally scheduling and planning activities in your daily life that are cognitively stimulating. It's framed as like, we'll do this for your cognitive health, because you have learned from this therapy program that your cognition is very important to your functioning. And lastly, the last session talks about how we can manage barriers to activity planning. How can we overcome avoidance? How can we overcome procrastination? I'm excited to show you freshly squeezed data on my first pilot subject that I finished a whole therapy program with. So recall that I developed a self-report scale of cognitive motivation with 2 factors of cognitive approach and cognitive withdrawal. You could see that compared to from pre and post-treatment, the subject slightly reduced in cognitive withdrawal. We also administered, well, I didn't administer, I had a blinded trained assessor do it. So my trained assessor interviewed negative symptoms, and on the x-axis, you could see that this is the collection of amotivation symptoms, and this is the collection of emotional expressivity symptoms. So there was a decrease in amotivation symptoms after the therapy. Not much change for emotional expressivity. I expect that I didn't target these symptoms with my intervention. Here we have scores of functioning, and the higher the score, the better the functioning. You could see that there were improvements in social functioning and role functioning. And I want to share with you an anecdotal quote from my subject. After cognitive activation sessions, she said, "I usually overweigh the costs associated with an activity. It helps to prepare ahead of time for a planned activity, but not to languish in the planning." I recently applied for a career development research grant to conduct a waitlist control trial of this motivation therapy program. And I hope to track changes in patients using an eye-based biomarker of negative symptoms and cognition. I want to end this talk by reminding everyone about this concept of functional recovery in mental illness. Mental health recovery is a journey of healing and transformation for a person with a mental health disability to be able to live a meaningful life in communities of his or her choice while striving to achieve full human potential or personhood. I hope that my talk has inspired you to be creative with your interventions. Think about how we can improve our current interventions to optimize people's functioning in their everyday lives. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Tanya. That was really, really good. That was a good example, I think, of how there's an unmet need in the field, and then that can be the stimulus for some really interesting laboratory research, which can then be led to develop an intervention, which can then be eventually studied in a large clinical trial. So thank you. And that's some of what I think the next generation of this field is going to be. Because as everybody knows, I think there really hasn't been a focus so much on these negative symptoms, but they're really some of the most disabling symptoms that people have. But we don't have medications to treat them, and most psychological therapies don't really do anything either. So this is really important work. So thank you. And now I'd like to see if anyone has any questions here. Okay.
Yes, thank you so much for this very interesting talk. I agree. It's refreshing to hear someone discuss functional recovery. We don't hear enough on that topic. My question relates to the fact that people with serious mental illness, mostly psychosis, are individuals who have more medical problems, less self-care and increased cost of care and shortened lifespan. So do you have any comments on interventions like this? Is there anything in the literature, or do you have thoughts on interventions to improve motivation, self-care, potentially leading to reduced cost of care and maybe longevity?
That is a really good question. I think some of these goals to improve physical health and healthy lifestyle did come up with my pilot subject. When we were doing behavioral activation, the subject's goal activity was to lose weight and exercise more. So what she found really helpful was using the skills to balance the costs and benefits of engaging in exercise and healthy eating patterns. I'm just recalling when she did this therapy tool, when she used this therapy tool, she was really grateful to have it down on paper, like these are the benefits. I need to remind myself of the benefits of doing these healthy habits, and also these are the costs, and let's problem solve around the costs. When the subject actually carried out their activity plan, we discussed afterwards, like, were any of your predictions of like how costly this activity would be, were any of those predictions proven not to be true? And that was the case. This individual ended up overestimating the costs of eating healthy, sticking with an exercise regime.
Okay, we have a question from a Zoom attendee, and that is, do you have thoughts on whether individuals at clinical high risk for psychosis would be less likely to experience loneliness despite social functioning impairments because of decreased motivation? Might the presence or absence of loneliness be an interesting prognostic factor? This sometimes occurs in older adults as dementia increases in severity. At some stages, increasing loneliness is a good thing, in quotes, because it demonstrates maintenance of the essential human need for connection, which then decreases as apathy increases.
That is a really good question, and also probably an idea for a great study in the future to understand loneliness and how that affects social functioning. Something that I didn't get to is with negative symptoms, they don't function, they don't express in a vacuum. We have an individual within systems of systems, and things like, the political climate can affect someone's motivation. Loneliness, lack of family support can affect negative symptoms.
Yes, okay, well, the asker of that question is an expert in loneliness who happens to be in our department, so I will discuss that with you afterwards.
I'm open to collaboration.
Okay, we have another question in-house.
Thank you, Dr. Tran. If my memory serves me correctly, the last time I heard one of your talks, I think it was also about negative symptoms and also using more app-based approaches to improving the negative symptoms. And I was just curious, since that time, how has the field evolved as far as using app-based approaches? Are there folks that are thinking that you can combine some of the novel therapy techniques as you discussed today with more of those app-based approaches?
So digital therapeutics for mental health problems as a whole has been trending. And in terms of how effective digital therapeutics are for negative symptoms, the jury is still out on that. The clinical trials are still undergoing. And I have my doubts. I do wonder, without a therapist, without guidance on that psychoeducation of how motivation impairments come to be. Are they able to pick up their phone, use an app, and help themselves with motivation? I'm cautiously optimistic about it, and I'm willing to learn more about where the field is going, because technology has been quite useful in maybe augmenting or being an accessory for mental health treatments.
Okay, we have too many questions to fit in, which is a really good sign.
Oh, gosh.
Because that doesn't always happen. But for the last one, let's go with Alex. And I've noticed it's great. A trainee has come from the faraway seats back all the way to the microphone.
I've traversed many rows to get here. Thank
so
you for accrediting me for my journey. I thought it was a lovely presentation. Something that I think about a lot when working with this population, and I'm sure my peers in the psychiatry side can agree as well, that sometimes the most challenging point of motivation is just helping patients attend their appointments with sufficient regularity for a therapy protocol to be put in place. And I'm curious if there's room in this intervention to target even something as initial or preliminary as session attendance and engagement in psychotherapy as an effort of motivation.
And you have 30 seconds to answer.
Oh gosh. This is what I like about psychotherapy programs. You could make it patient-centered. You can personalize the interventions according to these real-life examples of maybe the goal activity is improving motivation to attend appointments, and that could serve as the content of cost-benefit analysis, balancing, and behavioral activation, or maybe like cognitive activation.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, so Tanya, you will get a list of all the comments, and you can answer them, later. And yeah, wow, this was really interesting. A lot to think about. I want to thank everybody for coming, and we'll see Tanya again in a few years with some of these outcome study results. Have a good day, everybody.